Tonight, we descend into the quiet, velvet folds of history to examine a paradox that has haunted humanity for 6,000 years. We are going to trace the lineage of a substance that is at once a miracle of molecular engineering and a curse of biblical proportions. It is a story of silence, of the heavy, warm blanket that descends upon the mind to extinguish pain, but it is also a story of the terrible price paid for that artificial peace. Before we begin, let the tension of your day unravel. Picture a darkness that is not empty, but rich and ancient, a stillness that has been sought by emperors, soldiers, and poets alike. We are walking a path paved with good intentions, scientific hubris, and the desperate human need to escape suffering. This is the biography of the poppy and the white ghost it birthed, heroin. It begins not in a laboratory, but in the cradle of civilization under the relentless sun of Mesopotamia. Long before there were syringes or cartels, there was only a flower, Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy. To the untrained eye, it is merely a botanical curiosity, a fragile annual herb that rises from the dry earth on a hairy, glaucous stem, culminating in petals of striking crimson, white, or violet. But nature is rarely so innocent in its design. Evolution crafted this plant with a specific, potent defense mechanism, a chemical arsenal locked within the rounded, unripe seed capsule that swells beneath the petals. When this green globe is scored by a blade, a practice that has remained virtually unchanged for millennia, it weeps. A milky, viscous latex bleeds from the wound, oxidizing rapidly from white to a sticky, dark brown resin upon contact with the air. This resin is opium, a complex organic soup containing over 50 distinct alkaloids, molecular keys shaped perfectly to fit the locks within the human nervous system. The discovery of this resin was likely an accident of grazing or desperate foraging in the Neolithic era. But by 3400 BC, the Sumerians in Lower Mesopotamia had elevated its cultivation to a high science. They did not view it with fear, but with reverence. On clay tablets baked in the kiln of history, they inscribed the ideograms for the poppy, hull dollar gil dollar, the joy plant. It is haunting to imagine the first farmers of the Fertile Crescent, standing amidst vast, swaying fields of blooms, harvesting the raw gum that would eventually dictate the fate of nations. They understood intuitively that this plant possessed a spirit, a pharmacological soul that could banish dysentery, ease the agony of a broken bone, and lull a crying child into a deep, dreamless slumber. The knowledge of the joy plant was not kept secret. It was the first true medicine, passed from the Sumerians to the Assyrians and then to the Babylonians, flowing like the rivers that fed their crops. As the trade routes of antiquity expanded, the poppy traveled west, finding a receptive home in pharaonic Egypt. Here, the narrative of the drug begins to darken slightly, shifting from a simple agricultural joy to a tool of priestly power and medical necessity. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence dating to circa 1550 BC, prescribes the poppy for a litany of ailments, famously recommending it to stop the excessive crying of children. One can visualize the Egyptian physicians mixing the dark gum with fly excrement, a common binder, and honey, creating a sedative syrup that silenced the nurseries of Thebes. But even then, the duality was present. The god of sleep, Hypnos to the Greeks or Somnus to the Romans, was always depicted with poppies, often accompanied by his brother, Thanatos, death. The ancients recognized that the distance between the perfect sleep and the eternal sleep was measured only by the dosage. The drug permeated the classical world, becoming a staple of the Greek pharmacopoeia. It was the primary ingredient in theriac, the legendary panacea consumed by emperors to ward off poisoning and cure chronic pain. Yet it was the Greeks who gave us the vocabulary to understand the danger lurking within the resin. The word meconium, referring to the poppy juice, sat uncomfortably close to pharmakon, a word that famously means both remedy and poison. This linguistic tension defined the pre-modern relationship with opium. It was a mercy, yes, but a mercy that demanded respect. In the Odyssey, Homer speaks of Nepenthe, a drug of forgetfulness to banish grief, believed by many scholars to be opium dissolved in wine. We see here the first hints of the drug's psychological allure, not just as a painkiller for the body, but as an anesthetic for the soul, a way to erase the trauma of the Trojan War. It was the original antidepressant, a chemical escape hatched from the brutal realities of the ancient world. As the Roman Empire fractured and the lights of Europe dimmed into the Dark Ages, the knowledge of the poppy was preserved and refined by the Arab world. While Christendom suffered through prayer and superstition, Islamic physicians and alchemists were meticulously studying the properties of the brown gum. They traded it along the Silk Road, introducing it to India and China, planting the seeds of future wars. In these centuries, opium was consumed primarily orally, eaten as a bolus or dissolved in alcohol. The smoking of opium, the rapid delivery method that would later devastate China, was unknown. The drug remained a slow-acting, manageable medical staple. It was the stone of immortality to some, a divine gift that allowed surgery without screaming, a quiet companion to the dying. However, the world was changing. By the Renaissance, a new spirit of inquiry was taking hold in Europe. Paracelsus, the Swiss-German alchemist often called the father of toxicology, returned from his travels in the East with a potent secret. He dissolved opium in alcohol to create laudanum, a tincture that would become the aspirin of the next 4 centuries. "I possess a secret remedy which I call laudanum," he boasted, "which is superior to all other heroic aids." Note the word heroic. In the medical terminology of the time, a heroic medicine was one that produced drastic, immediate results. Laudanum was indeed heroic. It was cheaper than gin and more readily available. It became a staple in every Victorian household, the go-to remedy for headaches, menstrual cramps, tuberculosis, coughing, and melancholia. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the essayist Thomas de Quincey, and countless unnamed factory workers lived their lives in a haze of laudanum. It was the golden age of socially acceptable addiction, a time when the bottle on the bedside table was as common as a candle. But raw opium was messy. It was inconsistent. The potency of the gum varied depending on the soil, the rain, and the harvest time. A doctor could never be entirely sure if he was curing his patient or killing them. The scientific mind, obsessed with purity and precision, could not abide this natural chaos. As the 18th century bled into the 19th, the Enlightenment drive to categorize and isolate nature's components turned its gaze toward the poppy. The chemists of Europe suspected that within the complex slurry of the raw opium latex, there was a single active principle, a soul of the drug that could be extracted, purified, and mastered. They wanted to strip away the plant matter, the waxes, and the inert gums to reveal the pure, crystallized essence of pain relief. They had no idea that they were about to unlock a Pandora's box that would never be closed again. The year is 1804, and the setting is the dimly lit backroom of a pharmacist's shop in Paderborn, Germany. Here, the vague mysticism of the alchemist is finally dying, replaced by the cold, hard precision of the chemist. A 21-year-old apprentice named Friedrich Serturner is engaging in a dangerous game of molecular hide-and-seek. He is unsatisfied with the unpredictability of raw opium. He wants to know exactly which ghost within the gum commands the human nervous system. Through a tedious process of dissolving opium in acid, neutralizing it with ammonia, and precipitating the residue, he isolates a substance that has never been seen before in the history of the world. It is not a brown resin, but a pristine white crystalline powder. It is an alkaloid, a base substance that reacts like an alkali, and it is the first time a human being has successfully extracted the active ingredient from a medicinal plant. Serturner gazes at these white shards and names them after the Greek god of dreams, Morpheus. He calls it morphium. Later, the world will know it as morphine. Serturner, driven by the reckless curiosity of the era, decides that animal trials are insufficient. After watching stray dogs slip into comas and die from his new creation, he gathers 3 friends for a supper of science. They ingest the crystals. The result is a terrifying descent into near death. They vomit, their pupils pin, and they drift into a twilight state of respiratory depression that lasts for days. Sertuiner has proven two things. First, that he has isolated the sleep principle, and second, that this pure alkaloid is 10 times more potent than raw opium. The scientific community initially ignores him, but by the 1820s, chemical manufacturing takes hold. Merck begins commercial production in Darmstadt. The genie is out of the bottle, and it is wearing a white lab coat. Medicine celebrates. They finally have a standardized weapon against pain, a measurable dose that guarantees relief. But they have also distilled the addiction potential of the poppy into its most concentrated form. The pharmacological revolution required a delivery system to reach its full, devastating potential. For decades, morphine was still largely eaten or rubbed on the skin, limiting its speed of onset. But in 1853, a Scottish physician named Alexander Wood combined the hollow metal needle with a plunger mechanism, giving birth to the hypodermic syringe. This invention fundamentally altered the relationship between drugs and the human body. No longer did the chemical have to navigate the slow, acidic, treacherous path of the digestive tract. Now it could be punched directly into the bloodstream, bypassing nature's filters. Wood and many of his contemporaries labored under a tragic misconception. They believed that addiction was a hunger of the stomach. Therefore, they reasoned, if the morphine was injected into the vein or muscle, the stomach would not crave it, and addiction would be avoided. This medical fallacy led to the first great wave of iatrogenic, doctor-caused addiction. As the American Civil War erupted in 1861 and the Franco-Prussian War followed in Europe, the syringe met the battlefield. Morphine was the angel of the field hospital, the only mercy available for shattered limbs and amputations performed in septic tents. Doctors injected it liberally, grateful for the silence it brought to the screaming wards. But as the smoke cleared and the armies disbanded, tens of thousands of veterans returned home carrying a new burden. They suffered from soldier's disease, a polite euphemism for morphine dependence. These men were not criminals, they were heroes of the Republic, withered by a chemical need they did not understand. The needle had turned the painkiller into a lifestyle, and the medical establishment began to panic. They needed a cure for morphine addiction, a new miracle to fix the problems caused by the previous miracle. In the damp laboratories of late Victorian London, a chemist named C.R. Alder Wright was experimenting with the morphine molecule in 1874. He sought to modify its structure, to tweak the chemical architecture in hopes of finding a non-addictive alternative. By boiling morphine with acetic anhydride for several hours, he instigated a chemical reaction that attached two acetyl groups to the morphine molecule. The result was diacetylmorphine. Wright documented his findings, noting that the new substance caused great prostration and fear in dogs, and then, inexplicably, he moved on. The formula sat in the dusty archives of chemical journals for 23 years, a dormant seed waiting for the right rain. That rain came in the form of the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Elberfeld, Germany. It is 1897, a watershed year in the history of medicine. In one laboratory, Felix Hoffmann is synthesizing acetylsalicylic acid, aspirin, a drug that will become the most successful medicine in history. But just days later, under the supervision of the ambitious and profit-hungry Heinrich Dresser, Hoffmann repeats Wright's experiment. He acetylates morphine. The result is a substance that is lipid-soluble, meaning it dissolves in fat. This is the critical, fatal improvement. Because the human brain is protected by the blood-brain barrier, a fatty shield that keeps out toxins, regular morphine struggles to cross it efficiently. But this new diacetylmorphine, being fat-soluble, slips through the barrier like a ghost through a wall. Once inside the brain, it violently sheds its acetyl groups, reverting back into morphine, but doing so with a speed and intensity that creates a euphoric rush, unlike anything nature ever intended. Heinrich Dresser tests the new compound on workers at the Bayer factory. They report that it makes them feel heroish, heroic, strong, powerful. The name is found. In 1898, Bayer launches the product under the brand name heroin. The marketing campaign that follows is one of the most ironic and devastating in corporate history. Bayer aggressively markets heroin not just as a painkiller, but specifically as a respiratory sedative. Tuberculosis and pneumonia are the leading killers of the age. Patients cough themselves to death, their lungs tearing apart. Heroin suppresses the cough reflex with absolute efficiency. But the central selling point, the bold claim printed in medical journals and pamphlets distributed to doctors worldwide, is that heroin is a safe, non-addictive substitute for morphine. It is marketed as a pediatric cure. Bottles of heroin syrup are sold to soothe the coughs of infants. It is prescribed to morphine addicts as a step-down cure, a way to wean them off the needle. For a brief, shining decade, heroin is the darling of the pharmaceutical world. It is the modern, scientific answer to suffering, synthesized by the best minds in Germany and distributed with the efficiency of the industrial age. Doctors prescribe it for everything from menstrual pain to depression to nymphomania. But in the sanatoriums and the private clinics, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge. The patients supposedly cured of morphine addiction are not getting better. They are becoming enslaved to the cure, displaying a desperation that eclipses their previous habits. The tolerance builds rapidly. The withdrawals are savage. The heroic drug is revealing its true face, not as a savior, but as a tyrant that demands absolute submission. By the dawn of the 20th century, the medical establishment began to wake from its sedated reverie, blinking into the harsh light of a new reality. The reports flooding into hospitals like Bellevue in New York and the sprawling asylums of Paris were identical and terrifying. The patients who had been switched from morphine to heroin were not cured, they were chemically supercharged. The non-addictive miracle was displaying a ferocity of dependence that made the old morphine habit look quaint by comparison. Because heroin crossed the blood-brain barrier so efficiently, the crash was steeper, the craving more primal. In 1910, the unthinkable happened. The medical community admitted it had been wrong, but the admission came too late. The bottle was not just open, it had been shattered on the floor. Heroin had leaked out of the sanitized world of the pharmacy and into the chaotic, unmanageable ecosystem of the street. It was no longer just a medicine for the tubercular cough, it was becoming a fuel for the urban night. The demographic face of the addict began to mutate. In the 19th century, the typical addict was a middle-aged, upper-class housewife sipping laudanum for nerves or a decorated Civil War veteran. They were pitiable private figures. But as the 1910s roared into life, heroin found a new host, the young, urban, working-class male. In the dance halls of Hell's Kitchen and the docks of London, sniffing heroin became a dark vogue. It was cheaper than alcohol and easier to conceal than opium pipes. A subculture was born, complete with its own slang, its own rituals, and its own economy. The junkie was born here, named for the desperate addicts who scavenged and sold scrap metal or junk to feed a habit that legitimate wages could no longer sustain. Society did not look upon these new addicts with the sympathy reserved for the sick. It viewed them with the revulsion reserved for the criminal. The hammer fell in 1914. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was signed into law, a bureaucratic document that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of global organized crime. Ostensibly, it was merely a tax measure designed to regulate the trade of opium and coca products. In practice, interpreted by zealous enforcement agents, it became a total prohibition on the maintenance of addiction. Overnight, the doctor-patient relationship was criminalized. Physicians who prescribed maintenance doses to addicts, acting on the belief that addiction was a treatable disease, were arrested, paraded in handcuffs, and stripped of their licenses. The logic of the state was binary and brutal: cut off the supply and the addiction will vanish. It was a miscalculation of staggering proportions. They failed to understand that for the heroin-dependent, the drug is not a recreational choice. It is a cellular necessity, as vital as oxygen. When the clinics closed and the pharmacies locked their safes, the hundreds of thousands of dependent Americans did not stop using. They simply turned their gaze to the shadows. This is the moment the iron law of prohibition took effect. As law enforcement becomes more intense, the potency of prohibited substances increases and the market falls into the hands of the most ruthless operators. Enter the mob. In the 1920s, while Al Capone and his contemporaries were making headlines with bootleg liquor, a quieter, darker infrastructure was being laid by men like Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein, the brain of the American underworld, saw the mathematics clearly. Alcohol was heavy, hard to transport, and required massive breweries. Heroin was light, compact, and worth its weight in gold. A single suitcase of pure powder could yield a fortune that would require a fleet of trucks to match in whiskey. The criminalization of heroin necessitated an international conspiracy. The supply chain had to be reinvented, hidden from the prying eyes of customs agents and the newly formed narcotics squads. The raw opium was still legally grown in Turkey, a remnant of the Ottoman pharmaceutical trade. But it needed to be diverted, processed, and smuggled. A toxic geometry formed between the poppy fields of Anatolia, the clandestine laboratories of Marseille, France, and the hungry streets of New York City. This was the embryonic stage of the French Connection. Corsican gangsters, tough and tight-lipped, realized that Marseille was the perfect choke point. They had the docks, they had the corrupt chemists who knew how to turn morphine base into high-grade heroin, and they had the connections to the Sicilian mafia in the United States. Throughout the 1930s, this subterranean river flowed steadily, though it was largely overshadowed by the violence of alcohol prohibition. But World War II acted as a strange, suspended breath for the trade. The shipping lanes were mined, the borders were sealed by armies, and the flow of narcotics was disrupted. Addiction rates in the US actually dropped, purely due to the physics of scarcity. However, the war also planted the seeds for the next explosion. The US government, terrified of sabotage on the New York waterfront, struck a Faustian bargain with the imprisoned Lucky Luciano, the de facto boss of the American mafia. In exchange for ensuring labor peace on the docks and providing intelligence for the invasion of Sicily, Luciano was eventually deported back to Italy in 1946. This was not an exile, it was a corporate relocation. From his base in Naples and later Havana, Luciano helped reorganize the fractured heroin syndicates, smoothing the path for the post-war deluge. As the 1950s dawned, the French Connection matured into a fully industrialized operation. The Corsican chemists in Marseille perfected a method of synthesis that produced heroin of blinding purity, number 4 heroin, up to 98% pure China white. This was not the brown sludge of the past. This was a refined chemical weapon. It flooded into Harlem, the South Bronx, and the jazz clubs of Manhattan, carried in the false bottoms of diplomats' suitcases, inside hollowed-out cars, and within cans of imported paella. The price dropped, and the potency soared. The jazz world, led by icons like Charlie Parker and Billie Holiday, became tragically intertwined with the drug. Horse became the dark muse of bebop, a symbol of rebellion and outsider status. But for the African-American communities targeted by the mafia's distribution networks, it was no artistic statement. It was a plague. The government's response was to escalate the war. In 1956, the Narcotic Control Act mandated minimum prison sentences and even the death penalty for selling heroin to minors. Yet, the flow did not stop. It merely hardened the resolve of the traffickers and drove the price higher, increasing the crime required to support a habit. A vicious cycle was now spinning at maximum velocity. The addict robbed to buy the drug, the dealer bought guns to protect the cash, and the police militarized to fight the dealer. But this was all a prelude. The true globalization of heroin, the moment it would shed its Eurocentric roots and become a geopolitical force capable of toppling governments, was waiting in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia. The Cold War was about to heat up, and the poppy was about to be weaponized by the CIA, anti-communist warlords, and a lost army of American GIs. The map of the underworld was being redrawn, not by cartographers, but by the tectonic shifts of the Cold War. By the late 1960s, the French Connection, that transatlantic umbilical cord linking Turkish poppy fields to French laboratories and New York streets, was beginning to fray. American pressure on the Turkish government to ban opium cultivation was finally yielding results, creating a supply vacuum that nature and capitalism abhor in equal measure. But the market for oblivion did not shrink. It simply rotated on its axis, turning its gaze away from the arid plateaus of Anatolia and toward the steamy, lawless highlands where the borders of Burma, Thailand, and Laos dissolve into the Golden Triangle. Here, in the dense canopy of the monsoon forest, history was about to repeat its tragic cycle, but on a scale that would dwarf the operations of the Corsican mob. This was no longer just criminal enterprise. This was geopolitical chess played with poppy seeds. The Golden Triangle was a region forgotten by time, but keenly observed by the Central Intelligence Agency. In the frantic effort to stem the red tide of communism flowing from China and North Vietnam, the United States forged alliances with hill tribes and exiled warlords, specifically the remnants of the Chinese Kuomintang, KMT, army, and the Hmong people of Laos. These distinct groups possessed no oil, no gold, and no industry. Their only tradable currency, the only commodity that could purchase the rifles and rice needed to fight the communists, was opium. The agency, prioritizing the war against Marxism over the war against narcotics, turned a blind eye and occasionally lent a logistical hand to the movement of the product. Air America, the CIA's proprietary airline, became the ghost in the machine. Its cargo holds ferrying rice and munitions in, and often, implicitly allowing the cash crops to flow out to the refineries that dotted the Mekong River. It was in these makeshift jungle refineries that the chemistry of the trade evolved once again. The Golden Triangle chemists, taught by Hong Kong masters, began producing No. 4 heroin, a flocculent, snow-white powder of terrifying purity, often reaching 99%. Unlike the gritty Mexican mud or the lower-grade morphine base, this substance did not require a needle to seize the soul. It was so potent that it could be smoked, mixed with tobacco in a cigarette, or chased on foil, allowing the user to bypass the stigma and the terror of the syringe. This accessibility was the spark that ignited the powder keg, for stationed just a few hundred miles away was the perfect captive market, the disillusioned, bored, and terrified conscripts of the United States Army in Vietnam. The psychological landscape of the Vietnam War was uniquely fertile ground for addiction. Unlike the clearly defined front lines of World War II, this was a war of attrition and ambiguity, a green hell where death could arrive from a child's bicycle or a patch of disturbed earth. To cope with the crushing stress and the profound boredom of base life, the GIs turned to the cheap, ubiquitous white powder sold by houseboys and roadside vendors in plastic vials. For $2, the price of a pack of American cigarettes, a soldier could buy a heavy, warm blanket of insulation against the mortar fire and the moral confusion. They called it SCAG or SCAG, and it swept through the platoons like a viral infection. By 1971, official reports estimated that 15 to 20% of enlisted men in Vietnam were addicted to heroin. It was an epidemic that terrified the brass more than the Viet Cong. An army on the nod cannot fight, and it certainly cannot win. The panic in Washington was palpable. President Richard Nixon, sensing the political catastrophe of a junkie army returning to Main Street, declared the war on drugs in June 1971, identifying drug abuse as public enemy number 1. The administration launched Operation Golden Flow, a mandatory urinalysis program for every soldier leaving Vietnam. The mandate was simple: piss clean or you don't go home. Thousands of soldiers were forced into rapid, agonizing detox in humid barracks, sweating out the chemicals before boarding the Freedom Bird back to the States. The biological addiction might have been broken in those few days of misery, but the psychological imprint of the high, the memory of that perfect, total peace amidst the chaos of war, traveled back in the duffel bags of the veterans. They were returning to a country that was economically stagnating, culturally fracturing, and ill-equipped to heal them. As the 1970s progressed, the Asian white began to follow the soldiers home, finding new routes. By the end of the 1970s, the cultural glamour of the drug, if it ever truly existed, was dead. The deaths of icons like Janis Joplin, 1970, and Jim Morrison, 1971, though complex in their causes, were inextricably linked to the opioid haze of the era. Sid Vicious of the Sex Pistols would die of an overdose in 1979, cementing the image of heroin as the drug of nihilism, of no future. But the world had not yet seen the true peak of production. Far away in a rugged, mountainous land that was about to become the final battlefield of the Cold War, a new crop was being sown. The Soviet Union was preparing to invade Afghanistan, and in doing so, they would inadvertently till the soil for the largest heroin operation the world had ever seen. The center of gravity was about to shift west again to the Golden Crescent, where the Mujahideen were waiting, and where the poppy would once again become the currency of holy war. As the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, the epicenter of the global heroin trade began a migration westward, moving from the humid jungles of Southeast Asia to the arid, unforgiving moonscapes of the Hindu Kush. The Golden Triangle was not abandoned, but it was soon eclipsed by the Golden Crescent, an arc of lawlessness stretching across Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Here, in the rocky soil where wheat crops failed and infrastructure had been pulverized by Soviet gunships, the poppy thrived. It was the ultimate war weed, resilient and profitable. For the Mujahideen fighters engaged in a desperate asymmetrical war against the Red Army, opium was not a moral failing, it was a logistical necessity. It bought the Stinger missiles, the Kalashnikovs, and the winter supplies needed to bleed a superpower dry. The CIA, fixated on the Cold War chessboard, once again applied the telescope to the blind eye, allowing the caravans of raw opium to flow through the Khyber Pass into Pakistan, where refineries converted it into a flood of high-grade heroin destined for European and American veins. But as this new, granular wave of Afghan heroin broke upon the shores of the West in the early 1980s, it collided with a biological horror that would fundamentally alter the stakes of addiction. Until this moment, the dangers of the needle were immediate and visible: the overdose, the abscess, the embolus, the arrest. Now, a silent, invisible passenger began to hitch a ride in the blood that remained inside the syringe. The human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, found in the intravenous drug, used a perfect, efficient vector. In the shooting galleries of New York, Zurich, and Edinburgh, where works were rented and shared among dozens of strangers in a ritual of blood brotherhood and economic necessity, the virus exploded. The community of the addicted, already marginalized, became the epicenter of a plague. The emergence of AIDS transformed the junkie from a figure of pity or criminal revulsion into a pariah of contagion. The physical deterioration of the addict was no longer just the slow wasting of malnutrition. It was the rapid, terrifying necrosis of the immune system. Kaposi's sarcoma lesions became the new stigmata of the trade. This intersection of heroin and HIV forced a schism in public policy. While the United States doubled down on incarceration, filling prisons with users who were now dying behind bars, parts of Europe began to pivot toward harm reduction. They recognized that the virus was a greater threat to the body politic than the drug itself. Needle exchange programs, giving clean syringes to addicts to stop the spread, were born in this crucible of death, a tacit admission that the war on drugs could not be won, only survived. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the darkness of the AIDS crisis paradoxically gave way to a cultural glamorization of the drug that was grotesque in its irony. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Cold War was over, and a new era of globalized trade smoothed the supply lines. A new player entered the game, disrupting the market with corporate efficiency: the Colombian cartels. While they were famous for cocaine, the cartels realized that the U.S. heroin market was a stable, high-value diversification. They began growing poppies in the high Andes and producing a distinct type of heroin, often keeping the purity astronomically high. This high-purity Colombian heroin, which flooded the American East Coast, changed the mechanics of consumption. It did not need to be injected. It was potent enough to be snorted or smoked, removing the terrifying barrier of the needle and the fear of HIV. This ease of access birthed the era of heroin chic. In the fashion capitals of London and New York, the healthy, athletic aesthetic of the 80s supermodel was replaced by the waif, pale, skeletal, with dark circles under the eyes and a detached, narcotized gaze. It was a look that mimicked the end-stage addict, packaged and sold as high couture by designers and photographers who saw beauty in the decay. This was the era of the functioning addict, the Wall Street broker, or the Hollywood executive who could snort a line of premium diesel in a bathroom stall and return to a dinner party. The drug had been gentrified. It washed over the grunge music scene in Seattle, claiming its prophet, Kurt Cobain, in 1994, whose death became a generational marker not unlike the overdoses of the 70s, but amplified by the megaphone of 24-hour cable news. Pop culture began to reflect this normalization. Films like Pulp Fiction, 1994, and Trainspotting, 1996, brought the rituals of the drug, the cooking of the spoon, the tying of the tourniquet, the rush, into the suburban multiplex. While Trainspotting was arguably an anti-drug film, depicting the squalor and the horror of withdrawal with visceral accuracy, it also captured the undeniable allure, the hit that makes the misery worth it. Choose life, the film's mantra, became an ironic slogan for a generation that felt alienated by the consumerist promise of the 90s. Heroin became the ultimate opting out, a rejection of the rat race in favor of a warm, fuzzy oblivion. The stigma was eroding. Among the middle class, the perception grew that if one didn't inject, one wasn't a junkie. This was a lethal fallacy. The brain's opioid receptors do not care how the molecule enters the bloodstream. They only care that it arrives, and arrive it did in record quantities. By the late 1990s, the global production of opium had reached unprecedented levels. The Taliban, who had seized control of Afghanistan, initially allowed the cultivation to continue, taxing the harvest to fund their theocratic regime. In 1999, Afghanistan produced a staggering 4,600 metric tons of opium, supplying 75% of the world's heroin. The world was awash in the drug. Prices plummeted to historic lows, while purity remained at historic highs. A bag of heroin in Baltimore or Liverpool cost less than a six-pack of beer. The market was saturated. But the pharmaceutical industry, watching from the sidelines, saw this hunger for opioids not as a scourge, but as an untapped market opportunity. They saw the pain, they saw the addiction, and they believed they could engineer a safe version of the molecule that could be sold legally with a prescription pad to every household in America. In the corporate boardrooms of Stamford, Connecticut, executives at Purdue Pharma were preparing to launch a drug that they claimed would revolutionize the treatment of chronic pain. They had developed a time-release formulation of oxycodone, a semisynthetic opioid closely related to heroin. They called it OxyContin. Their marketing strategy was built on a singular, fraudulent premise, that because the drug was released slowly over 12 hours, it was less likely to cause addiction than traditional opioids. It was the same lie Bayer had told about heroin in 1898, repackaged for the 21st century. They were about to blur the line between the street and the pharmacy, creating a commercially sanctioned on-ramp to heroin addiction that would dwarf every epidemic that had come before. The stage was set for the perfect storm. A flooded global heroin market waiting for a new army of customers, and a pharmaceutical giant about to create them by the millions. The dawn of the new millennium brought with it a distinct, sterile kind of tragedy, one born not in the muddy trenches of a foreign war or the desperate alleys of a decaying city, but in the carpeted waiting rooms of American medicine. In 1996, Purdue Pharma unleashed OxyContin, a drug that was less a medical breakthrough than a masterpiece of aggressive marketing. The company's sales force, armed with charts, plush toys, and fishing hats branded with the drug's logo, descended upon general practitioners in the Rust Belt and Appalachia. They carried a gospel that sounded too good to be true because it was. They claimed that delayed absorption meant delayed addiction. They weaponized compassion, promoting the idea that pain was the fifth vital sign, a physiological metric that demanded treatment just as urgently as blood pressure or heart rate. Doctors, overworked and eager to relieve the suffering of coal miners with crushed backs and factory workers with arthritic knees, began to write. And they wrote with an abandon that flooded the American interior with synthetic opium. The result was an iatrogenic catastrophe, an epidemic caused by the healer. In towns throughout West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio, the fabric of community life began to dissolve. High school football stars, grandmothers, and injured mechanics found themselves bound by a common, insatiable hunger. The pills were pulverized, the time-release coating scraped away to reveal the pure oxycodone within, which was then snorted or injected to release the full 12-hour payload in a single, euphoric instant. Hillbilly heroin, they called it, a derogatory moniker that masked the terrifying reality. This was pharmaceutical-grade heroin, regulated by the FDA and dispensed at the local CVS. The pill mills of Florida exploded, clinics where doctors, armed with pre-signed prescription pads, saw hundreds of patients a day, cash only, turning the I-75 highway into the Oxy Express. But the laws of economics are as immutable as the laws of chemistry. As the 2000s wore on, the government began to tighten the noose. The DEA raided the pill mills. Purdue Pharma was forced to reformulate OxyContin in 2010, creating a gummy, uncrushable pill that was nearly impossible to abuse. Simultaneously, the street price of the pills skyrocketed. An addict with a heavy habit might need 300 milligrams a day. At $1 a milligram, that was a $300 daily liability. The prescription pad, once the golden ticket, was becoming a closed door. Millions of Americans were now chemically dependent, their brain chemistry permanently altered. Their dopamine receptors shrieked for an agonist that was suddenly unavailable or unaffordable. They were standing at a precipice, sick with the dope sickness that feels like the marrow is freezing in the bone. And waiting at the bottom of that cliff, with perfect timing and entrepreneurial genius, were the Jalisco boys. From the tiny, agricultural state of Nayarit in western Mexico, a new breed of heroin trafficker emerged. These were not the flashy, gold-plated kingpins of the Sinaloa or Juarez cartels who moved multi-ton shipments across the border in tanker trucks. The Jalisco networks were small, cellular, and ruthlessly efficient. They specialized in black tar heroin, a crude, sticky, dark substance that looked like roofing tar or obsidian. It was unrefined compared to the China white of the past, filled with impurities that hardened the veins and blackened the skin, but it was potent, and crucially, it was cheap. While a pill habit cost hundreds of dollars a day, a balloon of black tar cost $10. For the suburbanite whose prescription had run dry, the math was undeniable. The switch was not a moral choice, it was a fiscal necessity. The innovation of the Jalisco cells was not in the product, but in the delivery system. They abandoned the dangerous, conspicuous open-air drug markets of the inner cities, the street corners where police could easily make arrests and where suburban buyers were terrified to tread. Instead, they adopted the pizza delivery model. A customer would call a dispatch number. A dispatcher would relay the order to a driver in a beat-up sedan packed with small balloons of heroin held in his mouth, to be swallowed instantly if pulled over. The transaction would take place in the parking lot of a Burger King or a strip mall, quickly, quietly, and politely. They offered customer service, giving free samples to new customers and rewarding loyalty. They followed the OxyContin trail, setting up cells in the exact suburbs and towns where the pill mills had created a ready-made market of addicts. This was the mechanism that brought heroin into the cul-de-sacs of Charlotte, the suburbs of Denver, and the quiet towns of Vermont. The face of the heroin user underwent a radical transformation. It was no longer the jazz musician or the Vietnam vet. It was the soccer mom, the honor student, the contractor. The suburbanization of heroin was complete. The stigma that had insulated middle-class America from the drug trade evaporated. Parents who had warned their children about the dangers of the inner city found their children dying in their own upstairs bedrooms, needles discovered next to varsity jackets. The overdose rates began to climb vertically, a grim geometric progression that baffled local law enforcement who were used to busting marijuana grow ops, not investigating heroin deaths in gated communities. As the market expanded, the supply chains solidified. The major Mexican cartels, seeing the success of the black tar model and the insatiable American appetite, began to industrialize the production of white powder heroin to compete with the Colombian product on the East Coast. They hired chemists to refine the process, moving away from the sticky tar to a powder that could be snorted, appealing to the user who still held a psychological barrier against the needle. By 2013, Mexico was the primary supplier of heroin to the United States. The purity levels were rising, the price was falling, and the police were overwhelmed. But just as the market seemed to reach a saturation point, a new variable was introduced into the equation, a synthetic disruptor that would make heroin itself seem almost benign by comparison. In the clandestine laboratories of China, chemists were dusting off old patent records from the 1960s, looking for a compound that was cheaper to produce than heroin, required no poppy fields, no sunlight, and no harvest season. They found the work of Paul Janssen, a Belgian chemist who had synthesized a powerful opioid for anesthesia. It was called fentanyl, 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine, fully synthetic, and scalable to infinity. A kilogram of fentanyl could be purchased online for a few $1,000s and cut into enough doses to kill hundreds of thousands of people. The cartels, ever the rational economic actors, realized that shipping bulky heroin was inefficient when a shoebox of fentanyl carried the same profit margin. They began to mix it into the heroin supply, often without the user's knowledge, to boost the potency of weak batches. The hot shot was no longer an anomaly, it was becoming the industry standard. The transition from a plant-based crisis to a synthetic one marked the beginning of the end for the traditional heroin era. The poppy, which had dictated the rhythm of addiction for 6,000 years, relying on seasons, rain, and soil, was being rendered obsolete by the beaker and the burner. The user, seeking the warm embrace of the morphine molecule, was now playing Russian roulette with a substance so potent that a few grains, the size of salt crystals, could shut down the respiratory system in minutes. The era of the overdose crisis was about to shift into its deadliest gear, fueled by a white powder that had never seen a flower. By 2013, the global narcotics market had crossed an invisible event horizon. The iron law of prohibition, the economic axiom stating that as enforcement intensifies, the potency of prohibited substances increases while their volume decreases, was about to reach its terrifying, logical conclusion. For over a century, the heroin trade had been bound by the cumbersome laws of agriculture. It relied on the seasonal whims of the poppy, the labor of peasant farmers in remote highlands, and the logistical nightmare of transporting bulky organic matter across international borders. But the cartels, operating with the ruthless efficiency of Fortune 500 companies, recognized that the poppy was an analog technology in a digital world. They realized that the future of addiction did not lie in the flower, but in the precursor. Why rely on the rain when you can rely on a chemical reaction? Why smuggle a ton of plant matter when you can smuggle a kilogram of synthetic powder that fits in a standard envelope and possesses the potency of an atomic bomb? The shift was seismic. Precursor chemicals began to flow in industrial quantities from the unregulated chemical factories of Hubei, China, to the Pacific ports of Mexico like Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas. There, in crude labs hidden in the scrublands of Sinaloa and Michoacán, the cartels synthesized fentanyl, The economics were staggering. A kilogram of heroin might cost a cartel $6,000 to produce and sell for $60,000 wholesale. A kilogram of fentanyl cost perhaps $200 to synthesize and could yield $1.5 million when cut and sold. It was the highest profit margin in the history of the illicit economy. But for the user, it was a game of Russian roulette played with a fully automatic weapon. Because fentanyl is active in the microgram range, a quantity invisible to the naked eye, the margin for error in the cutting process was non-existent. The street supply began to poison itself. At first, fentanyl was used to boost weak heroin, giving a potent kick to a bad batch. But soon, the heroin began to disappear entirely, replaced by a mixture of inert filler and synthetic opioid. The tragedy lay in the chocolate chip cookie effect. When mixing a batch of powder in a cement mixer or a kitchen blender, the fentanyl does not distribute perfectly evenly. It clumps, creating hot spots, concentrated pockets of pure death. A user could inject from the same bag for 3 days and feel nothing but relief, then hit a hot spot on the 4th day and be dead before the needle left their arm. The overdose was no longer a slow, drifting sleep. It was a sudden, violent cessation of life. The chest wall would rigidify, a phenomenon known as wooden chest syndrome, making CPR impossible. The lips turned blue instantly. The lights simply went out. But the cartel's most devious innovation was not just the adulteration of heroin, it was the weaponization of the pill. Recognizing that millions of Americans were orphaned by the crackdown on legal OxyContin, the cartels bought industrial pill presses. They began churning out millions of counterfeit tablets, small, blue, circular pills stamped with M on one side and 30 on the other, designed to perfectly mimic the legitimate 30 mg oxycodone pills sold in pharmacies. These blues or Mexis flooded the market. They looked like medicine. They were priced like candy, but they contained no oxycodone at all, only filler and fentanyl. This deception shattered the final barrier of safety. A college student buying a pill to study, a construction worker managing back pain, a teenager experimenting at a party. They were not buying a known pharmaceutical. They were buying a random dosage of a chemical weapon. The demographic of death expanded horizontally. It was no longer contained to the junkie stereotype. The obituary pages began to fill with the faces of the young, the promising, and the unsuspecting. First responders found themselves fighting a war against an invisible gas. Police officers and EMTs began carrying Narcan naloxone as standard issue, a nasal spray that could knock the opioids off the brain's receptors and reverse an overdose if administered in time. But the fentanyl was so strong, and its binding affinity so high, that the standard single dose of Narcan was often useless. Paramedics found themselves using 2, 3, 4 doses to revive a single patient, pulling them back from the gray edge of death, only to see them plunged immediately into the agonizing violence of precipitated withdrawal. The cycle of treat and release became a revolving door of trauma for medical professionals, who were reviving the same patients multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times a day. As the body count soared, surpassing the peak of the HIV epidemic and the Vietnam War, the nature of the high changed. The warm, euphoric embrace of the poppy, the joy plant of the Sumerians, was gone. Fentanyl provided a colder, more sedating, and shorter-acting high. It lacked the legs of heroin. Where a heroin user might need to inject twice a day, a fentanyl user had to inject every 2 to 3 hours to stave off the sickness. The addiction became a full-time job, a frantic, sleepless hustle that stripped away any remaining semblance of functionality. The streets of major American cities began to transform. The nod, the state of semi-consciousness associated with opioids, became ubiquitous. In the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia, the Tenderloin in San Francisco, and the Skid Row of Los Angeles, the sidewalks filled with figures bent at the waist, defying gravity in a frozen, narcotized slump. The market had become a predation machine. The dealers knew that a string of overdoses in a specific area didn't scare away customers. Perversely, it attracted them. In the twisted logic of addiction, An overdose meant the product was fire, that it was strong. Users would flock to the dealer whose product had just killed their friend, believing they could master the dosage that their friend had failed to control. It was a suicidal distinctiveness. The balloon effect had worked its dark magic. By squeezing the supply of prescription pills and destroying the traditional heroin routes, the government had inadvertently incentivized the creation of a drug that was easier to smuggle, harder to detect, and infinitely more lethal. By 2016, the music world was once again rocked by a high-profile death that signaled the ubiquity of the crisis. Prince, the legendary musician, died of an accidental fentanyl overdose after taking what he thought was a standard painkiller. If a man with the resources and isolation of a global superstar could not protect himself from the poison supply, what hope did the teenager in Ohio have? The crisis had permeated every layer of the social strata. The era of heroin was effectively over, the brand name remained, but the product was gone. We had entered the age of synthetic obliteration, a time when the drug supply was not just illegal, but fundamentally treacherous. And yet the chemistry continued to evolve. The cartels, watching the effectiveness of Narcan, began to look for additives that could bypass the antidote, substances that would extend the high and rot the flesh, leading the world into the dystopian nightmare of the present day. The evolution of the opioid crisis has now entered a phase that defies the vocabulary of traditional addiction medicine, descending into a realm of biological horror that would seem impossible if it were not visible on the streets of every major American city. As if fentanyl's lethality were not sufficient, the market forces, driven by a desire to extend the short duration of the fentanyl high, introduced a new adulterant around 2019 that has fundamentally altered the physiology of the user. This is xylazine, known on the street as tranq. It is not an opioid. It is a veterinary sedative, a heavy-duty alpha-2 agonist authorized only for use in cattle and horses during major surgery. It was never intended to enter the human bloodstream, let alone be injected multiple times a day. But in the ruthless economy of the drug trade, it solved a logistical problem. Fentanyl has no legs, wearing off in mere hours, while xylazine knocks the user out for a longer, heavier duration, mimicking the nodding sedative effect of the old heroin. The consequences of this chemical marriage are grotesque. Xylazine causes a profound vasoconstriction, a clamping down of the blood vessels that starves the skin of oxygen. This leads to the emergence of necrotic wounds, not just at the site of injection, but randomly across the body, on shins, forearms, and hands. These are not typical abscesses, they are chemical burns from the inside out. The tissue turns black, crusts over into a hard eschar, and then sloughs off, revealing bone and tendon. Emergency rooms are now filled with patients suffering from wounds that resemble trench foot from the First World War or the flesh-eating effects of crocodile in Russia. Amputations have become a routine tragic outcome of the addiction. The joy plant has been replaced by a substance that literally eats the user alive, turning the human body into a decaying vessel for a chemical that provides no euphoria, only a blackout amnesia. The introduction of tranq has also broken the safety net of the overdose reversal. Naloxone, the miracle spray that saved thousands of lives during the initial fentanyl wave, operates solely on opioid receptors. It can scrub the fentanyl from the brain, restoring the respiratory drive, but it has absolutely no effect on xylazine. First responders now face a terrifying clinical paradox. They administer the Narcan, and the patient's breathing may improve slightly as the opioid is displaced, but they remain comatose, sedated by the cattle tranquilizer. They cannot be woken up. They lie on the pavement in a state of suspended animation, vulnerable to the elements, assault, and aspiration, trapped in a chemical twilight that medicine has few tools to counteract. The rescue is no longer a guarantee. It is a roll of the dice. This pharmacological shift has transformed the visual landscape of urban decay. In neighborhoods like Kensington in Philadelphia, which stands as the grim ground zero for the tranq epidemic, The streets are populated by figures trapped in the trank walk. This is a state of semi-consciousness where the user, fighting the overwhelming sedative gravity of the drug, bends at the waist, their upper body hanging perpendicular to the ground, swaying but not falling. It is a tableau of mass paralysis, a slow-motion collapse of human motor function. The social contract in these zones has completely evaporated. The sidewalks are no longer public spaces, but open-air hospices for the dying, littered with the orange caps of syringes and the debris of survival. The localized misery has metastasized, spreading from the East Coast westward, infiltrating the drug supplies of Chicago, Los Angeles, and Seattle, proving that no market is immune to the economics of the cut. The tragedy is compounded by the systemic failure of the treatment infrastructure. The gold standard medications for opioid use disorder, methadone and buprenorphine, Suboxone, were designed to treat heroin addiction. They work by occupying the opioid receptors to block cravings. But the chemists are always one step ahead of the legislation, modifying a molecule here, twisting a carbon ring there, creating new compounds that are technically legal until the government catches up, by which time a new variation has already taken its place. It is an arms race between bureaucratic ink and molecular engineering, and the engineering is winning. The modern crisis is no longer about getting high. Talk to any long-term user on the street today, and they will tell you with heartbreaking clarity. There is no euphoria left. The rush is a distant memory. They are injecting simply to feel normal, to keep the sickness at bay, to numb the pain of the rotting wounds and the despair of their existence. The drug has stripped away everything, the pleasure, the pain relief, the dignity, leaving only the raw mechanical need. The industry that began with the Sumerian joy plant and the Victorian miracle cure has reached its final nihilistic conclusion. A product that offers nothing but a temporary suspension of consciousness, sold to a customer base that it is rapidly exterminating. The ultimate tragedy is not just the death count, which now exceeds 100,000 souls a year in the U.S. alone, but the total dehumanization of the living, who are drifting through our cities like ghosts, tethered to a chemical that has no history, no soul, and no mercy. As we stand at the terminal point of this long, harrowing trajectory, looking back across 6,000 years of history, we are left not with a conclusion, but with a profound and unsettling silence. We have traced the lineage of the poppy from the sun-drenched fields of the Sumerians, who naively baptized it the joy plant, to the sterile laboratories of the 19th century that sought to distill that joy into a white powder, and finally to the clandestine reactors of the modern era that have abandoned the plant entirely for a synthetic coldness. It is a story that reads like a tragedy of hubris, a Promethean cautionary tale in which humanity stole fire from the gods to warm itself against the cold of existence, only to burn the house down. The miracle drug that medicine so desperately sought, the perfect painkiller with no price attached, was a phantom. It never existed. The laws of physiology are as rigid as the laws of physics. There is no relief without a reckoning, no high without a crash, and no chemical peace without a biological debt that must eventually be paid in blood. The journey of heroin is, in many ways, the shadow history of human progress. Every era got the drug it deserved, or perhaps the drug it created. The ancient world, bound by the rhythms of nature and the mysteries of the gods, accepted the raw opium gum as a sacred, dangerous gift. The Industrial Revolution, obsessed with extraction, purity, and efficiency, gave us morphine and the hypodermic needle, mechanizing the delivery of relief, just as it mechanized the loom and the steam engine. The chaos of the 20th century, with its world wars and cold wars, weaponized the supply chain, turning the addiction of soldiers and the desperation of the poor into geopolitical currency for warlords and intelligence agencies. And now, in our digital, disconnected, hyper-accelerated age, we have fentanyl and xylazine, drugs that are synthetic, instant, scalable, and devoid of any connection to the earth. The drug has evolved as we have evolved, becoming colder, faster, and more lethal, a dark mirror reflecting our own technological alienation. We must also reckon with the failure of our institutions. The medical establishment, the very guardians of our health, acted as the original architects of this disaster. From the German chemists who branded heroin as a cure for morphine addiction to the American executives who branded OxyContin as a cure for pain, the narrative has been driven by a dangerous arrogance, the belief that we could outsmart the human nervous system. They treated pain not as a signal to be understood, but as a defect to be deleted. In doing so, they inadvertently created a market for oblivion that no amount of policing could ever dismantle. The war on drugs, waged with trillions of dollars and millions of prison sentences, proved to be a war against a hydra. For every field burned, a lab opened. For every route closed, a tunnel was dug. The state attempted to use force to solve a problem that is fundamentally spiritual and medical, and the result was the creation of a black market so robust it rivals the GDP of nations. But beneath the geopolitics, the chemistry, and the corporate malfeasance, there remains the singular, fragile human element. The story of heroin is not really about the molecule, it is about the pain it soothes. It is about the Vietnam veteran trying to quiet the noise of the jungle in his head, the rusted-out factory worker in Ohio trying to numb the ache of a broken back and a lost future, the traumatized teenager in the inner city trying to escape the reality of violence. The needle is a symptom, not the disease. The demand for the drug is a metric of our collective suffering. As long as there is trauma, as long as there is a void in the human experience that feels unbearable, there will be a search for the warm blanket. The tragedy is that the modern supply no longer offers that blanket. It offers only a trapdoor into darkness, a binary switch between sickness and unconsciousness. The high has been engineered out of existence, leaving only the handcuffs of dependence. The transformation of the addict in the public imagination, from the pitiable victim of the 19th century to the criminalized junkie of the 20th, and finally to the dehumanized zombie of the current trank crisis, is perhaps the greatest moral failure of this entire saga. We have watched the physical deterioration of human beings in real time, their bodies turning into necrotic evidence of our societal neglect, and we have largely responded with revulsion rather than rescue. The people standing in the Trank Walk on Kensington Avenue are not ghosts. They are the end result of a chain of events that began in boardrooms and situation rooms far away from the street corner. They are the collateral damage of a century of bad policy and scientific overreach. To look at them is to look at the wreckage of the miracle, to see the true cost of the lie that we could conquer pain without consequence. As we fade out, the future remains uncertain. The poppy fields of Afghanistan are currently being plowed under by a new regime, but the labs in other corners of the world are humming with activity, synthesizing the next generation of nitazenes, compounds that will make fentanyl look benign. The cycle of innovation and prohibition continues to spin faster and deadlier. The only way to break it is to fundamentally change our relationship with pain and with the people who are in it. We must dismantle the stigma, treat the addiction as the medical crisis it is, and address the root causes of the despair that drives the demand. Until then, the ghost of the poppy will continue to haunt us. It has shape-shifted from a flower to a crystal to a synthetic dust, but its power remains the same. It waits for the moment when the burden of being alive becomes too heavy, and it offers a release that is indistinguishable from death. The joy plant is dead. Long live the machine. The silence that follows is not peace. It is the absence of the screaming that came before. And in that silence, if we listen closely, we can hear the faint, rhythmic scratching of a chemist's pen, writing the formula for the next miracle, the next mistake, the next plague. The narrative of the opioid crisis often seeks a convenient terminus, a moment where the gavel falls, the settlement is signed, and the healing supposedly begins. But history, particularly the history of intoxication, refuses such clean delineations. In the wake of the fentanyl explosion, a new chapter of corporate reckoning emerged, playing out in the mahogany-paneled courtrooms of America. The Sackler family, the dynastic architects behind Purdue Pharma and OxyContin, faced a deluge of litigation that threatened to dismantle their empire. The public demanded a spectacle of justice, a stripping of assets that would mirror the stripping of dignity suffered by millions of addicts. Yet, the resolution was a study in the hollowness of modern accountability. While billions of dollars were pledged to abatement trusts, money theoretically destined for rehab centers and Narcan distribution, the architects themselves largely retreated into the shadows of their offshore havens, their personal fortunes bruised but intact. The lesson resonated across the pharmaceutical and illicit worlds alike. If the profit margin is high enough, the penalty is merely a cost of doing business, a tax on the destruction of the human soul. While the lawyers argued over the carcass of the legal market, the illegal market was undergoing a chaotic fragmentation that made the old French Connection or the monolithic Medellin cartel look like models of orderly conduct. The arrest and extradition of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was hailed as a victory for law enforcement, a decapitation of the Sinaloa cartel. But in the hydra-headed logic of the narcotics trade, decapitation results only in proliferation. The cartel fractured into warring factions, the Chapitos, the sons of Guzman, against the old guard of Ismael El Mayo Zambada. This internecine warfare in the Badlands of Culiacan had direct, lethal consequences for the user in Ohio and Vermont. A fragmented cartel is a sloppy cartel. The quality control, previously enforced by a central hierarchy to ensure repeat customers, vanished. Cookhouses, run by inexperienced chemists trying to fund their side of the war, began churning out batches of fentanyl with wildly inconsistent potencies, laced with impurities that acted as chemical shrapnel in the veins of the consumer. This destabilization birthed what epidemiologists have grimly christened the fourth wave of the overdose crisis. If the first wave was prescription pills, the second heroin, and the third fentanyl, the fourth is characterized by polysubstance stimulant use. The streets are now awash in a terrifying cocktail known as the goofball, a mixture of fentanyl and high-purity methamphetamine. The logic of the user here is desperate and functional. The fentanyl provides the numbing escape and the suppression of dope sickness, while the methamphetamine provides the energy to stay awake, to hustle, to guard one's possessions, and to counteract the heavy sedation of the fentanyl-xylazine mix. It is a push-pull on the cardiovascular system that is medically catastrophic. The heart is told to race by the meth and to stop by the fentanyl, often simultaneously. The result is a surge in heart failure, strokes, and necrotic mental states, where the paranoia of amphetamine psychosis blends with the nihilism of opiate withdrawal. The neurological footprint of this fourth wave is creating a population that is largely unreachable by traditional addiction medicine. The brain of a chronic methamphetamine fentanyl user undergoes a structural remodeling that is profound and, in some cases, permanent. The dopamine receptors are burned out, creating a state of severe anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure from any natural source. But the damage goes deeper. The executive function, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and impulse control, is eroded. We are seeing users who are not just addicted in the classical sense, but who are suffering from organic brain damage similar to traumatic injury. They wander the streets in states of agitated delirium or catatonic stupor, unable to comprehend the offer of help even when it is extended. The shelter system and the rehab industry are ill-equipped for this. They were built for the alcoholic and the heroin user, not for the chemically lobotomized casualty of the synthetic age. Simultaneously, the supply chain has migrated into the digital ether, rendering the traditional street corner model increasingly obsolete for the middle-class user. The dark web, accessible via the Tor browser and fueled by cryptocurrencies like Monero, has become the new Silk Road. Here, the transaction is sanitized, devoid of the violence and squalor of the physical drug deal. A teenager in a suburb can order M30 pills or powder from a vendor with a 5-star rating and have it delivered by a clueless postal worker in a vacuum-sealed envelope hidden inside a greeting card. This Amazonification of the drug trade has defeated the geography of interdiction. There are no borders on the blockchain. The connection between a lab in Wuhan, a distributor in Mexico City, and a mailbox in London is instantaneous and encrypted. Law enforcement is reduced to playing a game of digital whack-a-mole, taking down one marketplace only to see 3 more spawn in the code within hours. As we look toward the immediate future, a new geopolitical ticking time bomb is counting down in Europe. For decades, Europe was insulated from the worst of the fentanyl crisis by the steady, cheap supply of real heroin from Afghanistan. But in 2022 and 2023, the Taliban, seeking international legitimacy or perhaps enforcing religious dogma, enforced a draconian ban on poppy cultivation. The satellite imagery confirms a near-total cessation of the crop in Helmand province. The vast stockpiles of opium are drying up. When the heroin drought hits the streets of Berlin, Paris, and London, and it will, the vacuum will not remain empty. The Mexican cartels and Chinese syndicates are poised to flood the European market with nitazines and fentanyl to replace the missing poppy. We are standing on the precipice of a global synchronization of the crisis, where the horrors of Philadelphia and San Francisco are exported to the capitals of the old world. The social fabric is tearing in ways that will take generations to mend. We are witnessing the rise of an orphan generation, hundreds of thousands of children currently in the foster care system because their parents are dead or incarcerated due to opioids. This is a trauma that is epigenetic. It gets written into the DNA. These children are growing up in the shadow of the overdose, often raised by grandparents who are exhausting their retirement savings to buy diapers and school supplies. The foster care to prison pipeline is being greased by the grief of this epidemic. We are not just losing the current generation, we are handicapping the next. The rural communities where the pill mills first opened shop 20 years ago are now hollowed out shells, their economies destroyed, their workforces incapacitated, their graveyards full. The despair that economists speak of is not an abstract concept. It is a physical reality of boarded-up main streets and overrun morgues. In the face of this relentless chemical assault, the philosophy of harm reduction has been forced to evolve into something more radical. We are seeing the emergence of sanctioned overdose prevention centers or safe injection sites in cities like New York, places where users can inject under medical supervision. To the moralist, this looks like surrender, a state-sponsored enabling of vice. To the pragmatist, it is a triage station in a war zone. These centers do not cure addiction, but they stop the immediate death. They are the only places in the ecosystem where the iron law is suspended, where the user is treated as a patient rather than a criminal. Yet, they remain politically radioactive, operating in a legal gray zone, fighting for funding while the bodies pile up outside their doors. The debate over these centers highlights the central conflict of the age. Do we want to save lives, or do we want to enforce a moral code that the drug supply has long since rendered obsolete? The miracle drug has thus completed its transformation into a totalizing force. It dictates our foreign policy, burdens our healthcare system, militarizes our police, and haunts our families. It has exposed the fragility of our civilization, proving that we are not masters of our biology, but slaves to it. As the synthetic wave continues to mutate, moving from fentanyl to xylazine to whatever grim compound is currently boiling in a beaker in a clandestine lab, we are forced to admit that the solution will not come from a pill, a police officer, or a judge. It will require a fundamental reconstruction of a society that has become too painful for so many to inhabit without chemical armor. Until then, the ghost continues to feed. If we zoom out from the carnage of the American street corner, a terrifying realization begins to take shape. The opioid crisis is no longer a localized epidemic, but a pandemic of the human spirit that is rapidly colonizing the global South. While the West fixates on fentanyl, a quieter, equally devastating flood is drowning the developing world. In the bustling markets of Lagos, the fishing villages of Gaza, and the slums of Mumbai, a different synthetic opioid has taken hold. It is tramadol. Originally synthesized as a safer alternative to morphine, it has been weaponized by generic manufacturers in India and China who churn out tablets with dosages far exceeding medical limits. This is the poor man's heroin, a drug that allows the laborer to work through breaking fatigue and the soldier to fight without fear. It is the fuel of the Boko Haram insurgency and the quiet killer of the African youth. The pharmaceutical colonialism that sparked the American crisis is now replaying itself on a planetary scale, proving that the hunger for the warm blanket is not a cultural defect of the West, but a universal vulnerability of the species. This globalization of addiction speaks to a fundamental biological trap that evolution left unguarded. Our opioid receptors, the mu, kappa, and delta, were designed for rare, short-term bursts of endorphins to reward survival behaviors like eating or mating, or to modulate severe pain from injury. They were never engineered to withstand a relentless, high-affinity chemical assault. When a substance like fentanyl or high-dose tramadol floods these receptors day after day, the brain does not just get used to it. It rewires its entire architecture. This is the phenomenon of neuroadaptation. The brain, screaming for homeostasis, prunes away its own receptors, dampening its ability to feel natural joy, connection, or motivation. The addict is not choosing the drug over their family. They are operating with a broken survival compass that tells them the drug is survival. In the era of superpotent synthetics, this rewiring happens with frightening speed and permanence, creating a post-human state where the biological machinery of love and bonding is effectively cauterized. The terrifying frontier of this war is now moving from the chemistry set to the server farm. We are entering the age of algorithmic addiction. Just as pharmaceutical companies use artificial intelligence to find cures for cancer, criminal syndicates are beginning to employ generative AI to discover new psychoactive compounds. An AI model trained on the molecular structures of known opioids and their binding affinities can hallucinate millions of potential new drugs in seconds. It can optimize for potency, for duration, and crucially, for legality, tweaking the molecule just enough to skirt existing chemical bans. This is the infinite drug. We are facing a future where the supply is not limited by the harvest of a poppy field or the expertise of a cook, but only by the processing power of a GPU. The authorities are playing checkers, while the cartels are playing 4D chess with molecular dynamics. In this brave new world, the concept of recovery is becoming increasingly elusive. The traditional 12-step model, born in the alcohol-soaked parlors of the 1930s, struggles to gain traction against the sheer biological violence of modern opioids. When the brain has been subjected to the chaotic toxicity of the fourth wave, cocktail, fentanyl, meth, xylazine, and nitazenes, the cognitive baseline required for talk therapy or spiritual awakening is often absent. We are seeing a shift toward maintenance as a lifestyle. The idea of total abstinence is being replaced by the indefinite use of buprenorphine or methadone, not as a bridge to sobriety, but as a permanent prosthetic for a damaged nervous system. We are creating a caste of people who will require chemical support to exist for the rest of their lives, a pharmacological dependency that the state must underwrite or face a massacre. The cultural impact of this shift is a profound deepening of isolation. The Rat Park experiments of the 1970s famously suggested that addiction was a result of environment, that rats in a lush, social cage refused the drugged water that isolated rats consumed until death. But the modern synthetic opioid overrides the Rat Park effect. It is so potent that it can hijack the brain even in a supportive environment. It renders the user indifferent to the lush cage. We see this in the wealthy addict, the celebrity, the tech executive, people with every resource and social connection who still spiral into the void. The drug has become a superstimulus that outcompetes reality itself. In a world that is increasingly digital, fractured, and lonely, the opioid offers a synthetic intimacy, a chemical hug that requires no vulnerability and no reciprocity. It is the perfect drug for an age of disconnection. Furthermore, the economic tendrils of the trade have become inextricably knotted with the legitimate economy. The money laundering operations required to clean the billions of dollars generated by fentanyl are not just bags of cash in back rooms. They are complex trade-based schemes involving Chinese manufacturing, Mexican real estate, and American luxury goods. The shadow economy is so vast that it props up entire banking sectors and real estate markets. In some regions of Mexico, the cartel is not just a criminal group. It is the state, the employer, the road builder, and the bank. The heroin trade has evolved into a narco-feudalism, where the drug is the currency of governance. Untangling this would require an economic reset that the global financial system is unwilling to risk. We are locked in a symbiotic embrace with the very poison we claim to be fighting. As we stare into the abyss of the fifth wave, whatever that may be, we must acknowledge the failure of our language. We call it an epidemic, implying a disease with a start and an end. We call it a crisis, implying a turning point. But what if this is simply the new condition? What if the democratization of superpotent painkillers is an irreversible threshold for humanity? The genie of synthetic bliss cannot be put back in the bottle. We now live in a world where heaven is available for $5, but the price of admission is your soul. The challenge of the 21st century will not be conquering the drug, but finding a reason to live that is compelling enough to compete with it. We are in a race between the joy plants, digital successes, and the human capacity for meaning, and right now, the chemicals are winning. The silence of the grave is the only place where the craving finally stops. But for the living, the noise is deafening. It is the sound of the siren, the beep of the heart monitor, the rattle of the pill bottle, and the desperate, gasping breath of a civilization trying to remember how to feel pain without falling apart. The story of heroin is the story of our attempt to amputate a fundamental part of the human experience, and the phantom pain that follows is what we are living through now. The geopolitical architecture of the 21st century is being quietly reshaped by the chemistry of the synthetic opioid. While nations posture over trade tariffs, semiconductor chips, and territorial waters, a more insidious form of asymmetric warfare is taking place in the shipping lanes of the Pacific. The flow of fentanyl precursors from the chemical industrial parks of Wuhan and Hebei to the Pacific ports of Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas represents a new kind of Silk Road, one paved not with silk and spices, but with piperidines and acetic anhydrides. Intelligence agencies in the West have begun to view this not merely as criminal enterprise, but as a strategy of reverse opium wars. Just as the British Empire once brought the Qing dynasty to its knees by flooding China with Indian opium, there is a growing suspicion in the halls of Washington that the unchecked river of synthetic precursors is a form of geopolitical attrition, a way to weaken a rival superpower from the inside out without firing a single shot. The body count in the American suburbs acts as a grim scorecard in this silent, chemical Cold War. Diplomacy in the face of this trade has proven to be a theater of the absurd. The supply chain is deliberately opaque, a shell game of relabeling and transshipment. A barrel of chemicals labeled as detergent raw materials or petrochemical additives leaves a factory in China, changes ownership 3 times on the high seas, and arrives in Mexico to be diverted into the clandestine labs of the Jalisco New Generation cartel. The cartels have become logistical savants, integrating themselves into the legitimate global economy so thoroughly that untangling them would mean halting legitimate commerce. They are the shadow Amazon, delivering death with the same efficiency that the licit market delivers consumer electronics. The borders are porous not because of a lack of walls, but because the global economy demands flow, and the drug simply piggybacks on the relentless momentum of capital. As the street crisis deepens, the pharmaceutical industrial complex is executing a lucrative pivot. The same industry that lit the fuse of the epidemic with OxyContin is now positioning itself to sell the fire extinguisher. We are witnessing the dawn of the recovery industrial complex. The blockbuster drugs of the future are not painkillers, but antagonists, long-acting injectable formulations of buprenorphine and naltrexone that block the opioid receptors for a month at a time. The business model has shifted from creating the addict to managing the addict. It is a cynical brilliance. First, capture the customer with the poison, then retain the customer with the antidote. Wall Street analysts now view opioid use disorder as a stable, long-term growth market, a chronic condition like diabetes that requires a lifetime subscription to pharmaceutical maintenance. The cure is not freedom. The cure is a monthly injection that keeps the demons at bay for a price. But the science of containment is pushing even further into the realm of science fiction. In research labs funded by the National Institutes of Health, scientists are currently racing to develop an opioid vaccine. This biological intervention would train the immune system to recognize the fentanyl molecule as a pathogen, creating antibodies that bind to the drug in the bloodstream and prevent it from crossing the blood-brain barrier. It is a concept that challenges the very definition of free will. If we can vaccinate a population against the ability to feel a specific high, are we curing a disease, or are we bioengineering the human experience? The final frontier of this tragedy may lie in the genetic editing of the human genome itself. With the advent of CRISPR and gene therapy, there are theoretical discussions about editing the OPRM1 gene, the instruction manual for the mu-opioid receptor. In theory, we could breed a generation of humans who are physically incapable of feeling the euphoria of morphine. It would be the ultimate end to the 6,000-year love affair with the poppy. But in doing so, we might strip away the very mechanism that allows for social bonding, for maternal love, and for the natural relief of pain. To kill the addiction, we may have to kill a fundamental part of what makes us human. It is the ultimate expression of the mechanistic worldview. If the machine is broken, rewrite the code. But the human soul is not software, and the glitch is not in the receptor. It is in the world we have built around it. The story of heroin has thus become a story of entropy. It is a system losing energy, spiraling into disorder. We started with a flower that grew in the sun, and we have ended with a dark web transaction for a chemical that stops the heart in 3 minutes. We have moved from the ritual to the habit, from the habit to the sickness, and from the sickness to the extinction. The miracle drug that medicine regretted has become the apocalypse drug that humanity cannot escape. The loops of history are tightening. The Sumerians called it Hul-Gil, the joy plant. Today, the street dealers call it Feti, Trank, or Iso. The names change, but the silence at the end of the needle remains the same. It is the silence of a question that has gone unanswered for millennia. Why does it hurt so much to be alive? As the sun sets on the era of the poppy, we are left to navigate a twilight world of our own making. The fields are empty, but the graveyards are full. The factories are running 24/7, synthesizing the next wave, the next hit, the next promised land that turns out to be a graveyard. The history of heroin is the history of a lie, the lie that we can cheat the balance of nature. And as we look at the wreckage around us, the only truth that remains is the one the ancients knew all along. The sleep is deep, but the waking is brutal. The dust has not yet settled, but in the quiet spaces left behind by the cacophony of the crisis, in the empty bedrooms of the Rust Belt, the sterile corridors of the methadone clinics, and the databanks of the epidemiologists, a terrifying new reality is taking shape. We are beginning to understand that the opioid epidemic was not merely a public health disaster. It was a mass casualty event for the human spirit, a cultural stroke that has left a permanent lesion on the collective consciousness. The legacy of the poppy and its synthetic offspring will not be measured solely in overdose statistics or lost GDP. It will be measured in the silence of a generation that was chemically hollowed out, and in the hardening of a society that learned to accept mass death as a background condition of modern life. We have crossed a threshold where the abnormal has calcified into the mundane, where the sight of a body slumped on a park bench no longer elicits horror, but merely a weary, cynical navigation around the obstacle. This desensitization is perhaps the drug's final and most insidious victory. It has stripped us of our capacity for shock, but while the culture looks away, the biology of the survivor tells a different story. For the millions who have walked through the fire of fentanyl addiction and emerged on the other side, the war is never truly over. The brain, having been exposed to the nuclear heat of superpotent opioids, bears a scar that is invisible on an MRI but deafening in the silence of the night. This is the phenomenon of protracted acute withdrawal syndrome, PAWS, a clinical term that fails to capture the existential grayness that descends upon the recovering mind. The dopamine receptors, scorched by the synthetic sun, may take years to regrow if they ever fully recover. The survivor is left in a state of anhedonia, a biological inability to feel joy, trapped in a monochrome world where the memory of the high remains the only technicolor experience they have ever known. The burden of this memory is the phantom limb of the addiction. Just as an amputee feels the itch of a missing hand, the recovering addict feels the phantom weight of the warm blanket that is no longer there. Science is now grappling with the ethics of memory erasure. Researchers are exploring the use of beta blockers and advanced neurotherapies to disrupt the process of reconsolidation, essentially to edit the memory of the drug out of the addict's mind, to scrub the emotional resonance from the recall of the high. It is a desperate dystopian measure. To save the patient, we must lobotomize their history. We are considering deleting the most profound, albeit destructive, experience of their lives because the human will is no match for the molecule. It is an admission that we cannot compete with the ghost of the poppy. We can only try to exorcise it. The societal infrastructure is mutating to accommodate this new fragility. We are moving toward a panopticon of care, a surveillance state disguised as a safety net. Smart pill bottles that track when a dosage is removed, wearable biomonitors that alert authorities to changes in respiratory rate, and algorithmic risk scores that determine who is allowed to have pain medication and who is not. The privacy of the patient is being traded for the security of the herd. Pain, once a private sensation to be shared between doctor and patient, is becoming a forensic data point to be managed by the state. The future of medicine in the post-opiate world is one of deep suspicion, where every broken bone and post-surgical complaint is viewed through the lens of potential liability and addiction risk. The pendulum has swung from the reckless overprescription of the 1990s to a cruel asceticism, leaving genuine chronic pain patients to suffer in the cold, collateral damage in the war against the high. And what of the culture that birthed this hunger? The opioid crisis has acted as a brutal mirror, reflecting the spiritual vacuum of the 21st century. It flourished in the cracks of a society that prioritizes productivity over purpose and digital connection over human touch. The deaths of despair narrative suggests that the drug did not create the misery, it merely monetized it. As we look to the future, the economic landscape offers little hope for a natural remedy. The automation of labor, the gig economy, and the erosion of community institutions are creating a fertile soil for the next wave of chemical escape. If the fifth wave does arrive, it will not need to create a market. The market is already there, waiting in the lonely apartments and the hopeless towns, begging for a pause button on the grind of existence. The geopolitical ramifications are settling into a grim equilibrium. The narco-state is no longer an anomaly, it is a structural feature of the global economy. The illicit drug trade has become too big to fail, a dark liquidity that props up banks and borders. The blurred lines between the cartels, the chemical manufacturers, and the state actors suggest a future where the drug trade is simply another arm of asymmetric statecraft. We may see a world where synthetic opioids are used not just for profit, but as tools of societal destabilization, injected into the veins of rival nations to weaken their workforce and drain their treasuries. The opium wars of the 19th century were fought with gunboats. The opium wars of the 21st century are fought with shipping containers and cryptowallets, and the casualties are the invisible poor. Yet amidst the ruins, there is a strange, resilient flora beginning to grow. A new movement of radical empathy is emerging from the ground zero of the epidemic. Communities that have lost everything are banding together to reject the stigma, forming networks of support that operate outside the failed systems of government and medicine. They are redefining what it means to heal, moving away from the binary of clean versus dirty and embracing a spectrum of survival. They are teaching us that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. In the face of a drug that isolates, the only antidote is a radical, messy, unconditional togetherness. It is a fragile hope, but it is the only one we have. The history of heroin ends not with a period, but with an ellipsis. The molecule is still out there, evolving, waiting. The receptors are still in our brains, ancient and hungry. The pain is still in our hearts, demanding relief. We have walked the long road from the Sumerian fields to the synthetic precipice, and we have learned the hardest lesson of all. There is no chemical solution to a spiritual problem. We cannot drug our way out of the human condition. The joy plant was a myth we told ourselves to hide from the darkness, but the darkness is part of the deal. The only way forward is to walk through it, eyes open, hand in hand, without the shield of the needle. As the camera pulls back for the final time, leaving the microscopic view of the neuron and the macroscopic view of the shipping lane, we are left with the image of the human being, fragile, flawed, and infinitely precious, standing in the wind. The storm has passed, but the sky is still gray, and somewhere in a lab or a field or a basement, a chemist is picking up a pen. The cycle waits to begin again, but perhaps this time we will remember the cost of the miracle. Perhaps this time we will choose the pain of being awake over the peace of the sleep. As the global narrative shifts from the immediate shock of the body count to the long, grinding attrition of the aftermath, a disturbing new architecture of control is rising from the debris. We are entering the era of the post-opioid security state. The crisis has terrified governments not merely because of the deaths, but because of the ungovernability it creates. A population on the nod is a population that cannot work, cannot fight, and cannot consume. In response, the machinery of state power is merging with the machinery of biotechnology to create a surveillance grid that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. We are witnessing the birth of biocompliance. Probation officers in some jurisdictions are now utilizing smartphone apps that require offenders to film themselves swallowing their Suboxone or methadone, using facial recognition and motion tracking AI to ensure the medication is ingested. The chemical leash is no longer just a metaphor. It is a digital reality, tethering the recovering addict to a server that monitors their biological obedience in real time. This digitization of addiction extends into the very chemistry of the treatment. The pharmaceutical industry, having lost the battle for the safe painkiller, has pivoted to the smart antagonist. Clinical trials are underway for implantable devices, subdermal rods the size of matchsticks that continuously release buprenorphine for 6 months or a year. On the surface, this is a medical miracle, freeing the patient from the daily grind of the pharmacy line. But beneath the surface, it represents a profound shift in bodily autonomy. The patient is physically modified to be incapable of feeling a high. It is a technological imposition of sobriety, a locking of the doors from the inside. The question is no longer, do you want to get clean? But will you submit to the implant? The court systems are watching closely, eager to replace prison sentences with mandatory biomedical installations, creating a class of citizens whose neurochemistry is regulated by a court order. Simultaneously, the frontier of the crisis is expanding geographically, moving into territories where the healthcare infrastructure is too fragile to even measure the collapse. While the West focuses on fentanyl, the cartels and syndicates are turning their gaze toward the exploding youth populations of Africa. In Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, a silent epidemic is taking root, fueled not just by tramadol, but by the dumping of chemical runoff from the Asian manufacturing sector. The Global South is becoming the testing ground for the next generation of synthetic psychoactives, compounds that are too unstable or too toxic even for the American junkie. Here the addiction is often functional, driven by the brutal necessity of manual labor in extreme heat. The labor drug phenomenon is creating a workforce that is chemically bonded to their exertion, a dark echo of the colonial era where opium and rum were used to pacify and motivate enslaved populations. The empire of extraction has simply updated its pharmacological tools. In the high-tech laboratories of the West, however, the search for a circuit breaker has led science back to the mystical roots of the experience. The failure of traditional SSRIs and opiate antagonists to heal the broken brain has triggered a psychedelic renaissance. Researchers are dusting off the files on ibogaine, a potent psychoactive alkaloid derived from the root bark of a Central African shrub. For centuries, the Biwiti people used it for spiritual initiation. Now, neuroscientists are investigating its uncanny ability to reset the opioid receptors and eliminate withdrawal symptoms in a single, harrowing flood dose. It is a journey through the subconscious that users describe as a life review, a brutal confrontation with one's own trauma. The irony is palpable. To cure the sickness caused by the joy plant and its synthetic children, science is turning to another plant, one that offers not escape, but a terrifying hyperreality. We are attempting to fight the dream of the poppy with the nightmare of the iboga. But the most dystopian horizon lies in the realm of predictive policing applied to public health. Big data firms are scraping the medical records, credit card transactions, and social media habits of millions of citizens to build addiction risk scores. Just as a credit score determines your ability to buy a house, an addiction score could soon determine your ability to receive surgery, access life insurance, or get a job. A person flagged as high risk by an opaque algorithm might be denied pain medication after a car accident or forced into preemptive counseling. We are building a pre-crime division for the nervous system, where individuals are judged not on their actions, but on their statistical probability of succumbing to the molecule. The stigma of the junkie is being codified into binary code, creating a digital caste system that may be impossible to escape. As the synthetic supply chain evolves, we are also seeing the weaponization of dual-use chemicals. The cartels are increasingly utilizing precursors that have legitimate industrial uses, chemicals used in making perfume, rubber, or soap, to synthesize opioids. This makes interdiction nearly impossible. You cannot ban the ingredients for fentanyl without banning the ingredients for modern civilization. This chemical camouflage allows the trade to hide in plain sight, flowing through the arteries of global commerce, disguised as banal industrial solvent. The war on drugs has thus become a war against chemistry itself, a futile attempt to police the electron bonds of the carbon atom. The adversary is no longer a person or a gang. It is the boundless potential of molecular recombination. In the shadows of this technological and chemical arms race, the human element, the soul of the addict, is being squeezed into an ever smaller box. The narrative of harm reduction while saving lives has inadvertently accepted a grim premise that a certain percentage of the population is expendable or at least permanently broken. The safe supply movements, which advocate for government-provided heroin or fentanyl to prevent overdoses, are a tacit admission of defeat. They acknowledge that we cannot stop the demand, so we must sanitize the supply. It is a rational, humane response to a massacre, but it also signals the end of the ideal of a drug-free society. We are moving toward a model of palliative civilization, where we manage the pain of the populace rather than trying to cure the underlying disease of despair. The ultimate tragedy of the miracle drug saga is that it has eroded our collective ability to imagine a future without intoxication. The ubiquity of the opioid, whether prescribed or illicit, has conditioned us to believe that the baseline human experience is insufficient. We have bought into the lie that there is a pill for every problem, a chemical adjustment for every mood. The opiate crisis is merely the sharpest edge of a broader cultural surrender to the pharmaceutical solution. We are trying to engineer a life without friction, without sorrow, and without pain, failing to realize that friction is what gives us traction, and sorrow is what gives us depth. The hollow eyes of the fentanyl user are a warning of what happens when that project reaches its logical, lethal conclusion. As we stand on the precipice of the next era, the era of AI-designed drugs, genetic immunity, and surveillance medicine, we must ask ourselves if we are saving the human being or merely servicing the biological machine. The history of heroin has been a long, slow lesson in the limits of control. We tried to control the plant, and it enslaved us. We tried to control the molecule, and it poisoned us. Now, as we try to control the user with chips and algorithms, we risk losing the very thing we are trying to save: the messy, painful, beautiful autonomy of the human spirit. The story is not over. It is simply moving from the streets into the servers, from the veins into the silicon, a ghost in the machine that will haunt us until we remember how to live without the numb. And so we arrive at the terminal point of our investigation, standing amidst the wreckage of a 6,000-year experiment that began with a promise and ended with a plague. The long arc of the poppy, from the clay tablets of Sumer to the encrypted servers of the dark web, reveals a terrifying symmetry in the human condition. We are a species defined by our vulnerability to pain and our relentless, often suicidal, ingenuity in escaping it. The story of heroin and its monstrous progeny fentanyl is not ultimately a story about a plant or a chemical. It is a story about the failure of the modern project to solve the problem of suffering. We believed that through science, industry, and commerce, we could engineer a world where the human nervous system was no longer a burden, but a controllable machine. We were wrong. The miracle drug was the ultimate expression of this hubris, a chemical Icarus that flew too close to the sun of total euphoria, only to fall, burning, into the sea of addiction. The medical establishment, the original priesthood of this tragedy, must bear the weight of a profound reckoning. For 2 centuries, medicine sought the silver bullet, the compound that would kill pain without killing the patient, the high without the hook. From Sirtuina's isolation of morphine to Bayer's branding of heroin to Purdue's marketing of OxyContin, the narrative was always the same. This time, we have fixed it. But biology is not a code to be debugged. It is a balance to be respected. Every time we attempted to bypass the body's natural limits, the body struck back with a ferocity we failed to predict. The iron law of tolerance and withdrawal is the biological equivalent of gravity. It cannot be cheated. By refusing to accept this, medicine inadvertently transformed the healer into the dealer and the patient into the casualty, creating a crisis of trust that may never be fully repaired. We must also confront the geopolitical shadow that this trade has cast over the world. The joy plant has been the fuel of empires and the currency of warlords. It paid for the Victorian tea trade, funded the CIA's covert wars in Southeast Asia, armed the Mujahideen against the Soviets, and now enriches the cartels that are dismantling the rule of law in Latin America. The drug has acted as a dark lubricant for the gears of history, moving seamlessly through the cracks of the global economy. It has exposed the hypocrisy of the nation-state, which condemns the traffic with one hand while often utilizing it with the other. The war on drugs was revealed to be a performative ritual, a theater of enforcement that did nothing to stop the flow of the river, but merely forced it underground, where it grew toxic and virulent. We fought the supply, but we never truly understood the demand. The evolution of the drug itself, from the organic warmth of the poppy to the synthetic coldness of the nitazines, serves as a grim metaphor for our own alienation. We have traded the soil for the lab, the sun for the lead light, and the communal ritual for the solitary injection. The modern synthetic opioid is a drug of the Anthropocene. It is artificial, potent, efficient, and utterly devoid of spirit. It reflects a world that has become increasingly hostile to human fragility. The user, drifting into the trank walk on the streets of our decaying cities, is a mirror held up to a society that values productivity over connection and profit over people. They are the collateral damage of a culture that has lost the vocabulary for handling despair, leaving the individual to face the void with nothing but a syringe and a chemical that promises a temporary death. As we look to the future, the crossroads is stark. One path leads to the biosecurity state, a world where we manage the crisis through surveillance, implants, vaccines, and algorithms. A world where we simply engineer the capacity for addiction out of the human